Welcome back, everyone. I'm so grateful to see you all. I thought yesterday was just a tremendous day, and I am very, very excited about today. My name is Brig Daniels. I am co-director of the Wallace Stegner Center along with my colleague, Lincoln Davies. We will begin today, as we do here at the University of Utah, with our native lands acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the cultural enduring relationship and that exists between the indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect sovereign relationship between the tribes, states, federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach and activities. I'd also like to, just a few things. First of all, a special thanks to our donors who've made this possible. The R. Harold Burton Foundation, which is our founding donor, and for 30 years has stayed with us. Thank you. We also, with great gratitude, we recognize the Cultural Vision Fund, which is a supporter not only of this symposium, but all of our Green Bag programs, including Symposium, Young Scholars, and our lecture series. And lastly, a thanks to the Utah Nature Conservancy, which has provided support for this symposium. So a few logistics, just to, in the interest of time, we will only introduce speakers by their name and title, with the exception of our keynote speaker at the end of the day. We do have bios online, and we invite you to look at them. We have a very impressive group of people, and I think that will come out as they speak to you as well. There will be food and beverages available in the lobby during the breaks, and we welcome you to bring that in here if you are so inclined. If you leave during the presentations, we just note that there's an exit toward the back there, and that is often the least disruptive way to leave, particularly if you're leaving from sort of the back of the room. And for our questions and answers, we have set up Slido. If you want to ask a question, you can go to www.slido.com. There will be a hashtag there, and you just write in the words Stegner. That should allow you to leave questions, and our moderators have a device here so that we can get them. We also ask you, please, to fill out evaluation online. If you go to the Stegner Center's website for the symposium, you'll see that there. I'd like to turn it over here to my good friend and colleague, Bob Keiter. As many of you know, Bob is the founding director of the Stegner Center, and without his work, we wouldn't be here. So, Bob, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Brig, and thank you all for joining us today, both here in the moot court room and those of you who are online. We're pleased to be moving into the second day of the 30th Annual Wallace Stegner Center Symposium on Air Quality. This morning, we're going to get into a specific dimension of the air quality issue, and it's smoke from the point of view of air quality, but more broadly, it ties in with much of what we've already spoken about, or at least mentioned over the course of yesterday. The smoke issue is tied to, among other things, air quality generally, climate change, drought, urban and rural growth, and evolving policies, both at the federal and the state level. And we'll get into that and some of the, not only the problems, but the solutions this morning. So we have a great panel to address these issues. Let me introduce them. First up, we'll hear from Mallia, who's a research, Brent Keith. No, Derek, I'm sorry. I've got things one way or another. Derek Mallia, Research Assistant Professor here at the University of Utah Atmospheric Sciences Department, providing us with a scientific background on the issue. Secondly, Lisa Groh will speak about, who is a Howard W. Hunter Professor of Law at Brigham Young University Law School. She will address the question of smoke and fire from the perspective of disaster law. We then will hear from Deborah Sivas, the Luke W. Cole Professor of Law and Director of the Environmental and Natural Resources Law and Policy Program and the Director of the Environmental Law Clinic at Stanford University. And then we will wrap up with Brent Keith, who is the Federal Lands Policy Team Lead for the Nature Conservancy. I think the talks tie together. They'll each speak for anywhere from 8 to 10 minutes, and we'll have at least a half an hour then to field questions and to try to tie things together even further. So with no further ado, Derek, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll be talking about wildfire trends, and I'll be providing some insights from the lenses of atmospheric scientists. And so why do we care about wildfire smoke? And so I feel like I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but ultimately, when we're looking at air quality trends across the continental US, we see this dichotomy where we see improving air quality across the eastern US. And then if you look at the western US, we see the kind of this degradation or deterioration of air quality across this area. And so, the thought here is that poor air quality events across the western US, they're becoming more severe, and this is ultimately being driven by drier conditions. And so if we have drier conditions, we have more wildfires, and we have more wind-blown dust. It's also worth noting that this is kind of an older study now, but it's worth noting that we are seeing maybe a slight reversal in the trends even across the eastern US. And so presumably that's just because we're getting bigger fires and that smoke is being able to transport further to the east. It's worth noting that annual mortality from poor air quality rivals that or exceeds that of other natural hazards. So if you take air quality and look at the mortality and compare that to severe weather events like tornadoes, hurricanes, things like that, flooding, you actually have to put it on a log scale to actually be able to tell the difference. And so that's just because just in terms of mortality, air quality kills way more people, orders of magnitude more people than that of other severe weather hazards. Granted, it's a much more kind of slower process per se. And so this is kind of why we care about this issue. So maybe unsurprisingly, wildfires are becoming bigger. So we're seeing both an increase in the frequency and the intensity of wildfires. But it is worth emphasizing that it's actually the largest wildfires that are seeing the most rapid growth. So this is really what's kind of driving the growth in fire activity that we're seeing, is that our bigger fires are becoming much bigger. So we're really very much in the age of, or in the era of mega fires, where you have fires like the Dixie Fire or the August Complex Fire in 2020, 2021, where they, these were million-acre fires. So we really have entered a new regime in terms of fires. And along these lines, the largest wildfires burn the most land and emit the greatest amount of smoke. In terms of trends, the largest fires have increased by about 800%, so it's a pretty large increase. But then along those lines too, even though these these very large fires make up a small fraction of the total fires, if you actually look at the cumulative kind of burned area by these largest fires, these actually burn by far the most land. So this is actually why we care about this small number of these largest fires, because these, there's a small number of these kind of large fires, but they burn by far the most land. And of course, presumably, if they're burning more land, they're emitting more smoke. The thought here is that, there is a pretty, significant kind of climate change link here, in that if things are drier and hotter, you'll have more greater fire activity, greater burned area, and so on. And this is a pretty well established kind of link. It's also worth noting that historical kind of land management practices have also contributed to this problem as well. So it is kind of worth noting that as well. So we are indeed observing more smoke. So we kind of ran this kind of model-based analysis to kind of quantitatively link poor air quality during the summertime to wildfire activity. So on the panels on the left, what you'll see those kind of little circles. And what those kind of denote is the air quality trends in terms of PM 2.5, where the warm colors indicate a positive trend, or a trend where we're getting degradation in air quality. And then what we did along with this analysis is that with this model-based analysis, we can also tell you, okay, we have an increase of PM 2.5 due to wildfire smoke, but we can also tell you where is that wildfire smoke coming from and what is driving these trends. And so in this kind of analysis, what you can kind of see here is that, for example, if you look at California and you see those kind of bars, what those bars will kind of indicate is it'll tell you, the strength of that trend, but then it'll tell you where that smoke is coming from. And so if you look at California, maybe unsurprisingly, smoke that you're observing in California are coming from California wildfires, which is not super duper surprising. But along those lines, if you look at the Pacific Northwest, this is kind of an unfortunate area where there's a lot of different ecoregions that are contributing to the wildfire problem up there. They're unfortunately kind of sandwiched in this area where they're surrounded by ecoregions, all observing increases in fire activity. So it doesn't matter which summer it is. The Pacific Northwest, unfortunately, is probably seeing smoke from one of the surrounding ecoregions. Another note here is that wildfire plume rises are also becoming taller. And so a question you might have is, what is a wildfire plume rise? And so what a wildfire plume rise is, it's that buoyant column of smoke that's basically lofting smoke from the fire vertically up into the atmosphere. And so why do we care about the buoyant wildfire plume rise? And the reason why we care about this is that this can actually impact the geographical coverage of smoke. So basically, this wildfire plume rise acts as a chimney where it carries smoke up to, in some cases, up to like cruising altitude of a plane. And so what this can do is this can actually spread out the smoke over a much larger geographic region, increases the likelihood that that smoke gets caught up in the jet stream and then carried downwind to areas like, like New York City, Washington, D.C., and so on. On average, if you were to kind of look at these trends and kind of, look at these trends for about 20 or so years, on average, we're seeing about a quarter of a mile increase in plume rise heights. And so we are definitely seeing an increase here. And this is being driven by the fact that these fires are burning hotter. They're adding more buoyancy to the atmosphere. And so like a hot air balloon, it's going to rise up much more quickly. And so that's kind of what we're seeing here, and why plume rises are also kind of important. Understanding how these plume rises are going to evolve is a critical scientific question. So unsurprisingly, wildfires are going to increase in size and intensity through 2060s. We kind of cut off the analysis there just because of vegetative feedbacks that can really complicate the problem. But it doesn't really matter which climate scenario that you look at, whether it's more optimistic or pessimistic. But we do see increase in fire area for each of these kind of projections. And along these lines, we're also seeing an increase in wildfire plume rise heights that match the trends that we observed in that historical analysis. So by 2060, we might see plume rises that are anywhere from half a mile to a mile taller, which is pretty significant, and will have definitely ramifications of how that smoke is being spread around. It'll basically increase the geographic coverage of that smoke and therefore impact more communities and more people. Another thing that's worth noting too, and this will be the kind of final point that I'll make, is that we also expect a larger number of pyro-CBs. And so a question you might have is, what is a pyro-CB? And so pyro-CB is just short for pyrocumulonimbus cloud. And what it is it's a fire-triggered thunderstorm. And so fire-triggered thunderstorms are actually going to become more common. And so, and why these are really important is that if you have a fire-triggered thunderstorm over a wildfire, these thunderstorms are often very dry, and so they can create a lot of erratic winds underneath the wildfire and help the wildfire spread. It can also be very treacherous for fire managers, and so this is one reason why we care about the pyro-CBs. And along those lines too, they have a lot of lightning as well, and so they can spark new fires. We saw that with the British Columbia fires in 2022. And then the other thing is that pyro-CBs, because they're really, really tall, these are lofting up to cruising altitude, if not higher. The reason why we care about these is that it will definitely increase the geographical coverage of smoke. These pyro-CBs can actually result in smoke that covers the entire kind of hemisphere in some cases. And then the final note that I want to make here too is that we also have to worry about invasive species. So if you have forests that are more stressed, just due to drought, they're more susceptible to bark beetle infestations, for example. And these bark beetle infestations can kill off large portions of the forest, which can be a really conducive environment for really explosive fire growth, like what we saw here with the Creek Fire in 2020, where we had a fire that advanced into an area of bark beetle killed off forests, and then basically went on a major run, produced a lot of smoke, and produces pyro-CB, which was able to kind of get that smoke really far up into the atmosphere. So small invasive critters like bark beetles, they're small, but they can have really big consequences. And so that's kind of what my research has kind of unveiled over the past, 6 or so months. And that's it. And thanks to my funding sources for supporting this work.
Gonna grab the cooker and sit over here where I can see my slides the best. So I'm very grateful to be with you all this morning. So I think of myself primarily as a disaster law scholar, not an environmental law scholar, but there's this very interesting intersection between disaster law and environmental law, and the question of wildfire smoke sits right at that really interesting intersection. So a lot of what we think about in disaster law is we have a set of rules, right, that we use in normal times, our normal set of rules. And how do those rules apply during disasters? So are the disasters of a kind or a type that require us to rethink how our normal rules apply? So often in this context, we see things like exemptions or waivers from environmental rules. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans filled up like a bowl of very, very contaminated soup, basically, that had to be discharged somewhere. And the fastest way for them to get rid of the water that had accumulated was to pump it into Lake Pontchartrain in a way that would normally require Clean Water Act permits. But the president invoked a waiver that allowed him to basically create an exception to the rules during that time period of emergency. So we're often thinking about, in the disaster context, what are the rationales that would lead us to exempt a particular disaster from a normal set of rules that we apply in everyday life. In this context, our normal environmental rules. And some of the things that we would often say to justify this are like, disasters are rare, they're unusual, they're not what our normal rules are meant to regulate, they're anomalous, they're unpredictable and sudden, we can't plan for them in the same way sometimes. They're outside of immediate human control, although there's a lot of human factors that go into disasters. In fact, it's sort of a commonplace in disaster law. There's no such thing as a really truly natural disaster. But we often think of them, at least when they're happening, as outside of our immediate control. They're temporary, they're not long-standing anomalies. They can be severe in ways that overwhelm our normal capacities and limit the normal options we have available to us, and they often demand a quick response. So these are some of the reasons that we sometimes think about modifying the way that our normal rules apply in disasters. But this arrow between like our normal rules and disasters also goes the other way. That is, we also have to think about, does the occurrence of disasters alter what our normal rules should be? Are they really changing our normal times into some kind of new normal, right? So should the occurrences of disasters change the normal rules we're applying in sort of our everyday non-disaster kind of situations? And the question of wildfire smoke really raises this question very directly, because we have disasters, wildfires, that are increasingly changing our air quality more and more often throughout the year. And so we have to think about, are we going to modify the way that we regulate our air based on these disaster events? So the normal rules that apply in the context of clean air, obviously the Clean Air Act, which requires the EPA to establish national ambient air quality standards for certain pollutants. And in the context of wildfire, some of the most relevant pollutants are particulate matter under 2.5 microns, for which we have daily and yearly standards, and ozone, for which we have an 8-hour standard. And areas that don't meet these standards are classified as non-attainment areas in various degrees and are required to develop implementation plans to come into compliance. But as we think about how should these wildfire events affect the ways we normally regulate under the Clean Air Act and what our normal controls on sources of pollution are, we have to think about the way that Congress has told us so far to address this question, which is that Congress since 2005 has had a provision for exceptional events. And if something qualifies as an air quality violation or exceedance because of one of these exceptional events, then the data, that exceedance at the monitor, is excluded from the data that the EPA uses to make regulatory determinations about, for example, whether an airshed is in compliance with the NAAQS. So the way that the statute approaches this question is to say an exceptional event is one that causes poor air quality. They are not reasonably controllable or preventable. They're natural in origin, or if they're caused by human activity, they're unlikely to recur at a particular location. And then they have to be approved by an EPA process that includes public notice as well as the EPA getting demonstrations from the state or the other regulators about the relationship between the smoke in this case and the air quality. And so then if it does get classified as an exceptional event, then again that data, that exceedance at the air quality monitor, is excluded from the data that we use to determine how we should regulate these airsheds. The way that the EPA has looked at how we approach wildfires as exceptional events is they require some causation evidence, which is easier now because of modeling. They also, when they think about is this preventable or controllable, they have a presumption that wildfires that are predominantly on wildlands are not controllable or preventable. So wildlands are areas that are less developed where there's not very much human infrastructure, but they come up against human development in an area that we in this field call the wildland-urban interface, the WUI, and wildfires that are in that interface are also sort of presumptively considered to be not controllable or not preventable, and therefore could qualify as an exceptional event. In terms of how the EPA thinks about wildfires being human or natural in origin, they say that wildfires that are predominantly on wildlands are natural. So that means that they're not subject to that frequency event or limitation for human activity. And this includes even wildfires that are human-caused in ignition that we know originated from some human event or from utilities or from fireworks or anything along those lines. So what kind of justifications are there for exempting this kind of exceptional event data from our regulatory air quality analysis? Well, we could say they're exceptional, right? They're rare, they're infrequent. But again, the way the EPA has looked at this in the wildfire context, they don't require it to be infrequent if it's a natural event, because it's just presumptively not something that's controlled. We also think of them as events, right, which implies that they're episodic, that they're temporary, and that they're uncontrollable. So again, they're presumptively treated, wildfires are presumptively treated as uncontrollable if they're natural, and they're natural if they occur in the wildlands or in the wildland-urban interface, which we know does ignore the human role in fire, which has lots of different components: human ignition, the way our land use patterns exist, climate change, our practices of fire suppression in many places that have made the possibility of bigger and more severe wildfires very real. But in some sense, they aren't controllable through the mechanisms that we normally have through the Clean Air Act, right? We can't really control the source of the pollution once it's underway. And for a lot of states, they would say these aren't controllable by us, by our regulatory authority, because as Derek was pointing out, a lot of the air pollution from wildfires is coming from outside their jurisdictions, right? It's coming from other states, or it's coming from fires on federal lands. So those are some of the potential justifications for saying we're not going to let what's happening with these disasters really impact how we're regulating our air on a day-to-day basis. How are these exceptional event exclusions being used? Well, many different states are using these kinds of exceptional events exclusions, or more and more are asking for it. So you can see the darker the state is, the more of these requests that they have made. Most exceptional events requests that we see in most jurisdictions are for wildfires. Wildfires are represented in the red. That orange is for high dust events. We get more and more of these exceptional events exceedances that the regulatory agencies are blaming on other jurisdictions. And the bigger the circle is, the more of the exceedances are being blamed on that state. So you can see that California is the state that is most often blamed in the regulatory documents for the exceedances. And the share of monitors where wildfire smoke is causing exceedances is increasing. So it's hard to see these exact numbers, but in some jurisdictions it's about 2% of exceedances that are being caused by wildfire smoke. So we're going to have to think about, as we move forward, whether wildfires are continuing, it should be treated as these exceptional rare events that we can kind of leave outside the thinking about what our baseline for air quality should be. Thanks.
Great. All right, thanks, Lisa, for getting us there. Okay, so this is not my slide. This is, there we go. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. As a lawyer, I don't do PowerPoints very much, but I just couldn't miss the opportunity. When you're doing wildfire, you can do a lot of good pictures. So I'm just going to show a few pictures and graphs, but I think this is a good setup to talk a little bit about potential solutions. So we've heard a little bit about the problem, and I work on cultural and prescribed burning, which is intentional controlled burning. And so just I'll indulge a little biography of how I got into this. So I have lived in California most of my life, or most of it anyway, and wildfires are a thing, right? And we see it every year. And I wasn't really paying too much attention until we had the Camp Fire in 2018. And it wasn't that big compared to what we're seeing now in some of these fires, 153,000 acres, but it actually burned down an entire town, right, and got a lot of people's attention, destroyed 18,000 structures, killed 85 people, billions of dollars in damages. So it was kind of a wake-up call, not that there hadn't been lots of fires before, but I would say that was the wake-up call. And then we just saw a series of things over the next couple of years. So we were all locked down in 2020. My kids were home. We were trying to figure out what to do, where we could go. And we went to the Sierra because that seemed like we didn't have to get on a plane and, go get exposed. And we went smack into the creek fire, which Derek mentioned, right? And it had that pyrocb. I love that because I can't pronounce the word, so I'm glad we have a short form for it, right? So we got chased out of the Sierra by this fire. We were just sitting on the lake. It was all nice, and then this fire came, right? So a major fire burned about 380,000 acres. But the striking thing was driving in. We were backpacking in the wilderness, but driving in through the national forest, there were an unbelievable number of acres with bark beetle, just tinder ready to go up, right? And this is what happened that year. Then, the next year we were in Tahoe, got chased out by the Calder fire, right? Again, burned down an entire town of grizzly flats. And so this is our future. This is where we're going. So, and that's just to give a sense of it. If you take the lens for the last 10 years, and I think maybe this repeats what Derek did, right? There are, we're seeing about 60,000 on average fires a year, small and large, right? But we're seeing, millions of acres burned every year. 2023 went down, probably weather conditions and meteorological conditions that year, then back up again last year. So looks like we've got a lot of wildfire going on. If you pull the lens back a little bit more, so 30-year timeline, right? That looks pretty dramatic, right? Wildfires going up, the number of acres burned going up, the number of fires maybe going even down a little. So they're getting larger maybe, but more acreage is burned. Okay, so that doesn't look good. Then we pull back even further. Right? Oh, okay, well, this is the historic record since the 20s, and we see that there was a massive amount of fire before 1930 or so. So what was happening in the mid 20th century? So people are old like me, Smokey the Bear, we suppressed all wildfires, and we got a regime that's very unhealthy. So we saw lots of natural wildfires before there was a huge population in the West. That was fire on the ground that was caused by mostly natural causes. Talk a little bit about the indigenous people, but then fell off entirely, and now we're creeping back up, right? So some of the groups that I work with, some of the NGOs, what their argument is, we need to put more fire back on the ground. Actually, we need to go back to some of the historic regime to get those ecosystems back to the normal fire regime. So what's the problem with that? So that's great if we're out in really remote areas, people aren't exposed to fire or smog. Here's the problem. In the last decades, we've moved into the WUI in a big way, right? So we're more and more people are in harm's way, and we see towns burning down, people dying, structures being destroyed, billions of dollars worth of damage. So we're not just going to let things burn, but if we keep suppressing fires, that's not a way out of the problem either. All right, so what is the future for us? One possibility is to do a lot more cultural and prescribed burning. So as I mentioned, that's actually putting fire back on the ground intentionally, right? So, and cultural and prescribed burning, the concept is the same, is you're doing controlled burns and trying to really get rid of some of the underbrush. You don't get in, that way the fires don't get into the canopy and get those very intense catastrophic type fires that we see, right? So indigenous people have been doing this forever, and it's very fascinating to read the history, right? Before colonization of the West, we saw the tribes doing this for lots of reasons. One was to reduce the fire risk to their communities, but the others were to manage the ecosystem some so that they were burning at times that promoted crops that they wanted grown or natural vegetation that they were using. And it's really interesting to talk to some of these tribes because they've passed down a history of people who know, like, you need to burn in October, like that's like to get a certain seed to sprout, right? So the cultural knowledge that they bring to this is fascinating. But as we went through the 20th century and said we don't want fires, right? A lot of that effort was stamped out. And I don't know state by state, but in California, no burning was allowed, no intentional burning was allowed until recent times, right? So how do we think about getting back to that regime and really using it to try to get the ecosystem back to health. So I just wanted to show this one study. So a bunch of researchers at Stanford did, through a modeling exercise and a lot of historical data, came to the conclusion that low-intensity fires reduce the risk of later high-intensity fires in conifer forests by 60%, and that those had lasting effects, or at least for about 5 to 6 years. So I think a study like this is showing us that there is a benefit here. We can try to manage the landscape a little better. You know, we've created something of the problem by interfering with the natural regime, and can we solve it? Okay, so in addition to the fuel reduction, there's a potential for air quality and public health improvements from smoke. I think the jury is still out on wildfires versus prescribed burning and the public health and smoke effects, but I think some of the studies are showing that in any event, a low-intensity controlled fire is preferable to having catastrophic type fires, right? One of the things is those really high-intensity fires, you get, I think, Derek maybe can back me up, you get more particulate emission. The other thing is if it burns into a community like Grizzly Flats or Paradise where the town burned down, you're also burning a whole bunch of other artificial, plastics and all that stuff. And we saw that just recently in the LA fires, right? Just a lot of nasty stuff burning. So you can control that with a prescribed fire. You get the watershed and vegetation management, habitat management, and then on the cultural burning side, which is different than what, say, the Forest Service might do, it allows tribes to really get back to some of their natural land stewardship. Okay, so that all sounds good. We should be doing it more. But what are the challenges and the barriers? So first is there's just a host of them. First are regulatory obstacles. So in most places you need an air permit from your local air pollution control district. That's what we call them in California. I'm not sure here, but and so that takes a while to get, right? And you have to go through a regulatory process. And then most places you need a burn permit. That's usually from your fire agency, like in California it's the CAL FIRE, other states different names, but you need to get that permit. And then potentially you have to go through your environmental review process and to show that you're not going to have significant adverse effects. So there's a lot of regulatory hoops to jump through. So that has really, we've done a lot of talking to practitioners of prescribed burning, and this is one of the problems. Second, public resistance, right? So nobody wants to live next to a controlled burn. Maybe better than a wildfire, but there's resistance. Potential for escape, people are worried about that. Rightfully so. The Forest Service has had 2 major escape fires in New Mexico in recent years, right? Workforce issues. So it's a very low-paying industry. We don't have enough people trained to do it. They're called burn bosses if you're doing a private burn. The indigenous folks have cultural fire practitioners, and then the agencies, right, Forest Service and state agencies, they're all short and shorter in the future on personnel. And then there's the scale of it, right, like it's very person power intensive, right, and you have to go back. You do a burn, 5 years or 6 years later, you have to go back. It's extremely costly. You need liability and protections and insurance, and we're doing a little in California trying to reduce the liability. And then there's just norms. The Forest Service has wanted to suppress fires, so it's very hard to get them to be burning fires. And there's cultural norms as well from the tribes. So there's just a host of things, and I'm happy to talk about that as we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks. And as the slide deck comes up, I can talk a little bit about the Nature Conservancy. And so I think many of folks are aware the Conservancy operates in every state in the US, and we also have a global presence in 78 countries around the world. For the purpose of this talk, I want to focus in on our western dry forests. And I think we've done a really good job of kind of understanding that the fire problem is particularly acute in the West, and it's particularly bad in these dry forests, where a history of fire suppression, climate change, and a growing wildland-urban interface have left a lot of these forests at very high wildfire potential. We have 37 million hectares, or a little more than 90 million acres across the West at extreme risk of wildfires. And so what do we do about this? As I think everybody on the panel has said, right, the sort of business as usual scenario of having more smoke, more wildfires, more homes damaged, more communities impacted is really not sustainable. And it's also important to note, so the Conservancy has 50 years of putting fire on the ground, of using beneficial fire as a tool for management. That fire is a keystone process. It's critically important in a lot of these systems. These systems have adapted to frequent low-intensity wildfires that help regenerate certain plant species, help provide wildlife habitat, help keep tree density relatively low in a lot of these dry forests. And there's really no plausible future in our western forests without fire. And so it's up to us to sort of decide and enact the policies to help move from a place where these fires are largely destructive to where they could be restorative, both for the ecology, the systems, but also for the communities, because there are jobs, there are other things that come with a restoration economy if that's the area we decide to move in. And so at the Conservancy, we're working for the trajectory of resilience on the sort of roots of the problem, and they're really complex. There's a lot of different things at play, right, as we think about how we can move the needle. The sort of area that I spend most of my time in is working in the policies and the regulations. And in January of 2022, the Forest Service launched the wildfire crisis strategy. Through that process, they've identified 21 landscapes across the western US. They've identified a little bit more than $3 billion in funding for those landscapes. And to date, they've been able to treat a little more than 2 million acres of these landscapes in the wildfire crisis areas. But it's worth noting that there are 50 million acres identified in the wildfire crisis area. And so 2 million acres is really a drop in the bucket. But it's going to take more in sustained investment. And, you know, we're at a moment in time where I think the future of those investments are very much in question. And the future of the wildfire crisis strategy itself, I think, is also very much in question. And I should also note, so the Conservancy works across these areas in bringing science to the table, really focusing on applied science to help inform decisions about when, where we can put fire on the ground. We work to do the direct treatments, and as it's been noted, these things don't sort of, it's not a one and done. We need to be re-upping these systems. A lot of the systems have something like a 10-year fire return interval, meaning they need fire every 10 years or so. And then we do a lot to build the capacity and the partnerships with folks on the ground, with tribal partners, local governments, communities, to understand that fire in a lot of these systems is a natural process and something that we need to bring back in a more controlled manner. And a lot of that also gets the social license to do the work on the ground, which for a host of reasons, as someone who grew up in Oregon in the sort of height of the spotted owl wars, is still a real struggle today. But I think there's an increasing understanding that we need more active management in a lot of these systems, that the hands-off approach with fire exclusion is really not the path forward. And so the Conservancy has been working to lead our federal policymakers in a direction to make some of these changes. Several years ago, we undertook an effort with the Aspen Institute to develop a roadmap for wildfire resilience. We came out with several recommendations that we thought would move the needle in building an all-of-society approach to the wildfire issue, because as I think being here at this conference notes, it's not just about the ecology and the landscape, right? All fires put off smoke. All fires have impacts on human health. And so we can't sort of look at this in a vacuum as, the Nature Conservancy's focus on the ecology. Following the Aspen Institute report, the U.S. Congress pulled together the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission, which came out with a report that largely reflected a lot of those same recommendations. And we've heard already a handful of these, including a lack of workforce, liability issues for prescribed fire going on the ground, both for the individuals and for the organizations working on it, and then also tools for planning to better integrate the science across disciplines with air quality and other factors. And then I'll get into a little bit of discussion around, the evidence that we can make a difference on a landscape. So in July of 2021, the Bootleg Fire burned a little more than 400,000 acres in south central Oregon, including 12,000 acres on the Nature Conservancy's Cycan Marsh Preserve. Somewhat coincidentally, the Nature Conservancy had been doing a lot of management on the Cycan, sort of as a living laboratory for how we can restore some of these systems, put fire on the ground, reduce susceptibility to future wildfires. And indeed, as this picture I think says better than I could possibly say, these treatments worked. Controlled burning was key to lowering fire severity in forests that were previously treated both with either thinning only or with thinning and prescribed fire. But I think, as you can clearly see, thinning and prescribed fire in conjunction provide the best defense to our forests to withstand these large, severe, catastrophic wildland fire events. And then there's also been some research. This Davis et al. Study is really interesting, and I think bears out a lot of what we saw in Cycan, that prescribed fire has a significant impact on the landscape. We see 72% reduction in thinning followed by underburning, a 60% severity reduction for both burn only and thinning followed by pile burning. And it's also worth noting the error bars. So these treatments do decrease over time, but putting fire on the ground actually gives us the most longevity in those treatments. So it lasts longer than thinning alone, which I think is really important. And again, another idea or another reason that we need to be putting fire on the ground. But as we've discussed in this conference, all fires have human health impacts. And so the thing that we largely lack are a better set of tools to make decisions about how do we balance these trade-offs between wildfire smoke and smoke from beneficial fires. So the Scholert study from 2023 looked at the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative and looked to build a framework for incorporation of these various considerations to balance what are, under different management scenarios, the smoke impacts expected from wildfires, what are the smoke impacts expected from prescribed fire, and what are those consequences downstream to human health. And at least in this area under the model that they ran, interesting, there is a diminishing return on more fire on the landscape, but the sort of light fire scenarios saw improved benefits both in reduced asthma hospitalizations and reduced asthma emergency department visits. And it's noted these numbers are sort of generalized over the entire state, and so they're not huge numbers, but the paper does also note that the local impacts are significantly greater. And so I think the real point in sharing this study is that we need more tools like this to understand the trade-offs and to move forward in a way that works for both people and nature. But I think the fact is there's no future in our western forests without fire. And again, it's up to us to decide whether that fire is destructive or regenerative.
Thank you for those presentations. I think it really sets the stage for a healthy discussion. We've got a number of questions, but let me start with one of the questions. We had both Deborah and Brent talk about prescribed fire as an option to deal with forest management and smoke problem. The alternative to that, which is promoted by some groups and professional and agencies, is some form of timber management or forest thinning. And that raises a host of questions. I wonder if you could talk about the pros and cons of that as an alternative approach to prescribed burning, and how the benefits and costs, sort of play out.
Sure. Well, that's potentially a really complex question, right, depending on how far down you go in bringing in markets in a lot of these areas. For example, there's not a milling capacity to really cut in a lot of these systems. They also have, throughout a lot of the western dry forests, the growth potential is relatively limited when you look at whether it is economically feasible and can compete with the fiber that you can produce in the southeast or in the Pacific Northwest or the coastal range. And I think it also bears looking back to the Davis study that in our experience in SciCan, that thinning alone does not provide the same resilience that thinning and fire together do. And it's also worth noting in a lot of these, particularly the dry forests, which I would argue are most at need of risk, the merchantable material is pretty limited. There's not a lot of large trees, for example, that can go to dimensional lumber. There's a lot of small diameter materials and a lot of underbrush. So I think it's a real challenge, and certainly not a sort of one size fits all to say that, but I think there's a real reason that fire is an important part of it.
Yeah, and I'll just add, because I do a lot of work with community groups and environmental groups who see the studies of thinning plus prescribed fire as being, but the politics of it are very challenging. We had the spotted owl stuff until today is still very challenging. And I would say that one of the concerns is that the Forest Service is so they've gotten money. We'll see where all that goes as we head into these new times. But partly what we've seen in the Sierra, at least, is that money is now being poured into proposals for very large old growth and mature forest logging, because that's where the remaining timber is that the logging companies want. And then prescribed fire is a little piece of it. And so I think and then those cases, those projects are getting litigated, right? So we're all held up by the politics of it. And that goes back to my point is we need to get all of the agencies aligned on a mission that's different than getting, nice timber off the forest. In fact, focused on the doing more of the prescribed burning. So it's a very complicated issue, and it's a very controversial issue. But it's expensive, as I said. Doing prescribed burning, I think that's probably what you guys know, is that it's very expensive and person intensive to do it. So it's hard. So an agency like the Forest Service, they'd like to, sell the timber and get the money for that.
And some of this, just to clarify a little bit further, is a result of changing forest management policies that really kicked in roughly about 30 years ago, the late 1980s, early 1990s, where the cut went down dramatically on the national forests in order to preserve ecological integrity. And as a result, a lot of mills closed, and hence are not necessarily, and were not equipped to deal with smaller diameter trees and timber. And so the sort of market forces are cutting against to both larger tree harvesting, lack of mills, and smaller tree harvesting. To some degree, some smaller diameter mills have ratcheted up, but the money is just not there. It requires subsidies from the federal government or elsewhere to make it profitable for companies to harvest that smaller timber. But it's a ongoing back and forth between, in this area, between the cutting of trees to eliminate the fire danger versus the prescribed fire in a broad sense. Lisa, question here. Let me make sure I've got it. Would smoke from a controlled burn be considered an exceptional event by the EPA? It's not natural.
Right. Very good question. It is not natural, which means it is subject to more restrictions based on the statutory language that applies. So in order for something that is caused by human activity to qualify as an exceptional event, it also has to meet the language that it's unlikely to recur in that particular location, which is a harder thing to show, right? Because if we're doing prescribed burning in a regular way pursuant to a plan, then you might need to do it on certain intervals, right? And so it might be likely to recur in that area, which means it's actually harder for prescribed burns to qualify for this exceptional events treatment that would allow the smoke from them to be excluded from the EPA's regulatory decisions under the Clean Air Act. So the EPA has tried to manage that in some ways by saying we're going to treat a prescribed burn as not likely to recur in a particular location if it's done with certain smoke management practices, if it is pursuant to a fire mitigation plan more generally. And so they're trying to work within that language but allow some more flexibility for prescribed burns. But we do have a regulatory environment because of this difference in the way the statute treats natural versus human caused that makes it more onerous in some ways to deal with prescribed burns and the air quality problems that result from them under this legal system than to deal with air quality problems that result from wildfires. And so we do need to think about what kind of incentives that's creating, right? And I think the evidence suggests that, this regulatory framework isn't necessarily having that much impact in terms of prescribed burns and deterring prescribed burns because there are so many other obstacles to prescribed burns. It's not clear that that regulatory framework is making that much of a difference right now, but it could more and more going forward as smoke is increasingly contributing and we're having more of these kind of problems and questions. And so it's something we need to think about, right? How do we manage our regulatory framework so that we're not deterring the kind of activity like prescribed burns that might decrease our risk overall and therefore decrease the overall amount of really serious smoke.
Thank you. Derek, question for you. The future projections provided by you during your presentation were frightening. What things can be done to change this outlook? Is it all baked in because of climate change?
Yeah, so that's a tough question. And so, I mean, I think unfortunately with climate change, like the ball is rolling with that. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we can do in terms of reducing our carbon emissions and so on. But, those effects wouldn't reduce the temperatures probably in our lifetime. And so we have to think about alternative strategies for mitigating the risks of wildfires. And so, I think, thinning and prescribed burns, that's the tool in our toolbox that can help us reduce the severity of these fires. And I think that can definitely help get things under control. And that's probably our best tool going forward. In terms of reducing our smoke exposure, another thing is developing forecast tools. So I like to think of wildfire smoke as a natural hazard like tornadoes, hurricanes, and so on. And so our forecast tools should also, like if you go to your weather app, for example, you should, there should be a tool out there that tells you like, okay, 5 days from now you're expecting smoke, so maybe you shouldn't go camping. So I think incorporating smoke forecasts as part of like the forecasting process would help reduce smoke exposure and at least give people a heads up that, hey, this may not be a good day to go hiking or camping and so on.
Other thoughts?
Well, I would just to add to that so prescribed burn, we've talked a lot about it, right? That's a tool. I mean, I think the other things, this doesn't help with the smoke, but in terms of protecting communities is much more aggressive kind of defensible space around communities to reduce the risk both to human life and to property. And a whole issue that we're getting into in California is hardening of structures to be more fire resilient. Very expensive, raises all kinds of issues about how that happens. But so there are other things to protect communities out there too.
Yeah. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. So those are questions about how we build, right? Like how hard our infrastructure is, what kind of roofs we have, what kind of vegetation barriers we have around our houses. There's also questions about where we build, right? How much we're really going to have communities right up against this wildland interface, but those are really hard questions because we're talking about a lot of pre-existing communities, and even when a community suffers a major fire loss, like the Palisades neighborhood, like that's very high value property, right? And people want to return, and so there's a lot of pressure to redevelop in very similar ways, but hopefully at least some mitigation can be done there about how they build and maybe exactly where they build, but that is a question we're just going to have to think about going forward is, can we have as much development in some of these really, really risky places in terms of that interface with the impact on people?
That gets into the broader question of land use policy. I think you've addressed it to some degree. Is this something that should be a matter of simply local responsibility, or should the federal government, and in particular, for example, the Forest Service, play a role in land use policy? Since we have this WUI zone and we have the federal lands butting up against privately owned lands, both of which are under different jurisdictions.
Yeah, I'll start on that, and then yeah, so really good question. And areas where the Forest Service or other federal land managers are bumping up against private property, you see what I've seen is the Forest Service being really reluctant to think about, their jurisdiction goes to the border of the national forest, right? And they're like, well, we're not responsible and we don't have jurisdiction there. But, that feels like a very archaic way to think about it, right? Because how do you protect those communities? It's maybe not doing remote logging, it's protecting those communities near in. So I think there are questions there. I think we are seeing a shift in the way federal agencies are thinking about this, but it's a big ship to turn and, have a new culture there. Just on the local impacts, so Lisa mentioned the Palisades and stuff, what I worry about is there's a rush to rebuild, right? And we do know standards, like even so there's the building standards, right? But even like just keeping vegetation even 5 to 10 feet away from the property actually significantly reduces the risk. But if your neighbors don't do it, you're probably at risk. Right, and so there's all these issues about how does the community rebuild, and I do see, like in California, there's now pressure not to have to do some of those things, which seems crazy because you're just rebuilding in the same risky way. So I think there's lots to be, but my sense is that the locals need to do it, state government too, maybe state regulations. The federal government has a role to play where their jurisdiction is near communities, but yes, I think all three levels have to come into play.
Yeah, I would just add, I completely agree. Fire doesn't obviously recognize property boundaries, right? And so our planning and preparedness needs to also be across all lands. And that's a theme that comes out in the Wildland Fire Commission report and others, is that we have to do a better job of coordinating across these. And I would also just bring into the conversation something that we haven't talked about, but I think is going to be a major driver in how we rebuild from wildfire events and where houses are, and that's the insurance industry. There's a lot of questions and a lot of challenges in folks getting home insurance, and there are now questions about what is the federal role in fire insurance. And so I think those are some things that could be real drivers of where homes are being built in the future.
Right.
Yeah, and just to build on the insurance question, I mean, I have a hard time thinking that the federal government is going to end up dictating a lot of local land use. The politics of that would be very complicated, right? But we do have models in other areas of disaster where the federal government has had an influence in part through insurance programs. So in the flood context, for example, we have a national flood insurance program because the private insurers were really not willing to provide flood insurance in a lot of areas, and we may be moving toward those similar kinds of problems with fire insurance, where there's going to be big gaps in the market, and states or the federal government, we have to think about who's going to play some of that role. But what's happened with flood regulation is that there's a community rating system based on how good the flood regulation is in different areas, and you get discounts on your insurance based on what kind of rating your community has. And so it creates incentives for communities to create regulations around floods. And we might see similar things evolving in the fire context as well, instead of a direct sort of regulation about how the local land development is happening, but more incentives about tied to money or insurance or other things that might create some of those incentives.
And just to follow up on that, we're talking about the sort of the using insurance to address the question. What are the basic standards governing liability in this area, both in terms of potentially federal liability for prescribed burns that get out of control, and there have been examples of that, or alternatively, privately, Nature Conservancy type prescribed burns that potentially get out of control and do either property or human damage?
Well, I'll have to admit that I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. I'm not an expert on it, but I do know, I mean, we've seen, I think, various tort claims theories, and so I think there are questions, you know, Congress is dealing with as there are waivers of tort liability, so long as you're following certain parameters of, you know, National Wildland Fire Coordinating Committee standards and guides and all of that. And I think those are the kinds of things that we're looking at in a way to incentivize folks being good actors and not being susceptible to claims.
Yeah, and one thing that I think it was 2021, California there's been a series of state legislative proposals to try to facilitate more prescribed burning. And so I think it was 2021. If you have a burn plan and you've gone through the hoops of getting everything approved, the liability risk is you're shielded except for gross negligence, right? And so that's a little bit of an incentive to people. This is on like private lands, right? But the other thing is, I would say that, like, you know, all things are connected. So we're talking about wildfire. We get to insurance, right? And the system being, you know, upside down really on the insurance side, and then, you know, in California, and I suspect here, that brings in the utilities, because they've been liable for starting a lot of these wildfires, including one of the big LA fires, the Eaton fire. PG&E has declared bankruptcy before. So then you bring in a whole another sector of stakeholders who need to be involved.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Can any of you comment on whether there are any studies on the long-term health impacts of smoke exposure on nearby communities and firefighters? They're aware of any studies and address that?
Yeah, so I'm not a health expert, but you know, there are some studies out there that have looked at impacts of wildfires. I think one thing and I've always found this surprising, but it seems like, you know, when you're talking about like PM 2.5, so particulate matter, you know, that can come from dust, it can come from wildfires, it can come from anthropogenic emissions, but it does seem like wildfire smoke actually seems to be the worst in terms of PM 2.5, so the chemical makeup of that. There's a couple of studies, I think, out of Scripps that have shown that smoke is definitely, in terms of PM 2.5, probably the most hazardous for your health. And yeah, there's some significant concerns with firefighters. I mean, I've talked to the U.S. Forest Service, and there's definitely a pretty strong interest of trying to map smoke exposure for firefighters and to kind of track that, because there's definitely concerns that those firefighters, they're at the front line, they're exposed to the most hazardous levels of PM 2.5 and smoke, and yet there's definitely some concerns that like lung cancer incidences are definitely a lot higher, depression, things like that. So it's definitely a big concern going forward.
Yeah, just to jump in on that, right? So this gets us into the workforce issues, which is a problem both for suppressing wildfires that are occurring, but it's also a problem for doing more prescribed burning. And we've done a little bit of work on the workforce issues. Very poorly paid federal workforce, right? Not enough folks in the private sector who's doing it. Those people barely even make a living, and yet those are the people who are most at risk from exposure to smoke. And then the one other thing I would add is it's interesting how things work, because it's, you live where you live, and like in California, we have kind of some of the worst problems in the San Joaquin Valley. And what happens during a Sierra wildfire event, often the meteorological conditions are such that becomes the target. These are some of the lowest income people in the state, like kind of trapped in the Central Valley being exposed. And yet we have the haze rule, so it makes it really hard to do prescribed burning in some of these areas, as you were saying, Lisa. So it's a cluster of issues, yeah.
Thank you. Getting a little closer to home, what are the challenges and benefits of wilderness areas when it comes to fire prevention efforts? Can you talk about the challenges of the Wasatch Front with 3 large wilderness areas? Are there, in addition to challenges, are there opportunities here? How does wilderness factor into the fire challenge and hence the smoke challenge?
I guess as one of the local people, I'll say something about this. I mean, obviously we love our wilderness areas, and sometimes we don't think about how much we are part of the wildland-urban interface here, right? That there is really substantial fire risk that we need to be thinking about, and I think we might be a little bit behind the curve on things like thinking about defensible space in a lot of our homes and communities, and thinking about those kind of fire mitigation issues in terms of where we site our communities and the building standards that we have. And so I think we're really lucky to be so close to such beautiful areas, but it also means we need to be thinking carefully about these issues. And we have some similar kinds of issues that could play out with our utilities as things that have happened in California. We have a lot of uninsulated lines. We have a lot of the similar kinds of risks from unburied lines that are in the air, sparking fires during high wind periods and things like that. And I know there has been some movement here to designate areas as areas where the grid might be shut down during certain kind of high wind events. And so those kind of thinking in advance about how we're going to deal with potential utility sparked fires is something that is starting to happen here. But I do think we need to do more to think of ourselves as a community where fire could become a really substantial risk moving forward.
Yeah, just as a local as well, I feel like Utah, at least so far, we've been relatively lucky. I think a good example is the Parlays Canyon fire from, I think it was 2022, but it was a big fire that went in a run on a mountain that was adjacent to Park City. Thankfully, it got under control. Fire conditions were pretty bad that day, but not there weren't really super strong winds, and they were able to contain that fire. But I do worry about with some of our communities that are building up into the wildland-urban interface, as Utah hasn't had the big fire yet that has had a big human impact, and I do worry that it's just a matter of time before that happens. So I think Utah as a whole needs to think about resiliency and protecting our communities going forward, and just doing everything we can, because we do get those downslope windstorms that you saw with the Palisades fire and the Camp Fire. We do get those kind of events. They're infrequent, but they do happen. And so a lot of the hazards that you have in California are things that we also see here in Utah as well.
I think the Wilderness Act provide some guidance on the limitations of human activities that can take place within those wilderness areas. And I think it's worth noting the Forest Service in any given year, I think, manages wildfires in wilderness areas pretty regularly and pretty successfully. But there are a handful of examples that folks can point to, right, where the Forest Service may have managed a fire for a week or two, sort of not aggressively suppressing, and then atmospheric conditions change and things go bad and the fire burns out of the wilderness. And so that then puts more pressure on how do we deal with all of those fires in the wilderness areas. But I think it's a real challenge, right? Because I think those places, their very being as part of it is being off sort of limits to, human intervention and management. But we can't keep those areas from being impacted by climatic conditions that are changing pretty drastically, and in a lot of ways forcing some systems change that are going on there. So I think there is, and there will continue to be, a real conversation around how do we not do full suppression in wilderness areas, and who is making those calls. Is it district rangers or others authorizing use of chainsaws, for example, instead of crosscut saws for fire crews in those areas? And it gets into some of those real tactical decisions that are made based on the conditions on the ground, the atmospheric conditions, the predicted weather forecast, fuel loads, and all of those things. So it's really complex, and there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, I think.
Right. And to provide just a little historical context on that, virtually all of those factors came into play back in 1988 with the Yellowstone fires that just about everyone remembers, and the scope and extent of them being running across the park and threatening nearby communities and everything, and in some cases having been fought initially, in other cases allowed to burn, and then all of a sudden weather conditions changed dramatically, and the fires were off to the races. We've got 2 or 3 questions that sort of tie together in my mind. Are there any pending bills or funding that could move Congress to help in this area? Relatedly, what are the barriers to shifting significant funding from firefighting to fire prevention? And the Forest Service is now often regarded as the firefighting service these days. And then what about bipartisan support for preventative funding? That is prescribed fires or possibly thinning or whatnot. Where's Congress and the legislatures on?
I can start. If we had all day, I could put there. I mean, there's a lot of legislation. I think, most significantly, the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law put really significant, sort of, folks refer to it as generational investments into these systems. But we generally see that as down payments on what's needed to make the change that we need to see. We saw around $3 billion going into hazardous fuels for the Forest Service. There are very real questions about whether they will be able to hold on to that money and put that money into the ground and into projects. And so, quite frankly, right now, I don't see a new immediate line of additional funding for the agencies. There's a whole flurry of legislation. There's a bill called Fix Our Forests Act. There's a Fit for Purpose Act and others that are sort of looking at shifting wildland fire fighting responsibilities away from the resource management agency, which also I think brings a lot of complexities because of the way the Forest Service is structured, and the fact that a lot of people within the Forest Service who are not classified as firefighters are a really important part of the overall fire response, and they hold red cards or serve on incident management teams. And so I think all of this is very much in flux. We do see really strong bipartisan support for more investment in the hazardous fuels reduction budget line item at the Forest Service. The question then comes down to how are those dollars being spent, and what are the projects that are qualifying as hazardous fuels reduction. There's quite a bit of leeway within that overall area for how those monies are being spent. But I think we're seeing a shift now towards what is the capacity of the Forest Service to produce saw logs. And that may provide some challenges then in addressing the fuel conditions that exist on these western dry forests that aren't particularly high value timber areas.
Right. Any other? It occurs to me in terms of prescribed burning or thinning for that matter, are there differences in terms of the different types of forests that we see throughout the West? We have one question about, how should we approach this in Utah where we have the dry pinyon forests and that sort of thing versus the lodgepole pine up in the Yellowstone country versus the more moist Pacific Northwest forests. Thoughts on that in terms of these techniques and strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's really great science around, what is the historic range of variability for fuel loads and stand condition class density of forests and all of that. And so there are absolutely big differences. Lodgepole pine is a system that tends to go through episodic events where they do burn in a pretty catastrophic way, and then they have regeneration all at once. Whereas a lot of ponderosa pine stands tend to be lower basal area, more low intensity, frequent fires. And then if you go to the Pacific Northwest and big Douglas fir, other systems, they really rarely burn outside of like the Tillamook fires in Oregon, or even a couple of years ago when a lot of the west side in Oregon burned. So there are really big differences, and the treatments are also really different. But I think there's really good science around that from our forestry programs.
We are unfortunately out of time. I should say we have a tremendous number of questions, all of which were good. I hope we managed to cover most of them in one form or another. We certainly got a lot of tremendous information from our panelists, so please join me in thanking them for taking the time to join us and sharing their knowledge.
Yes, thank you again to our panelists and for what a great way to start the day. We are going to go on break now. We will come back at 10:50. We ask you to be back here promptly, but feel free to stretch your legs and have a treat. We'll be back together to talk here in a bit. Thank you again to the panelists.